Today we will finish the Civil War by considering how both sides manned their armies, a statement from Lincoln's administration on slavery that would change the focus of the war, a turning point in Pennsylvania, the seizure of the Mississippi River by the Union Army, one man's destructive march to the sea, a final offensive in Virginia, and a Southern gentleman's gracious surrender at Appomattox in 1865. And while the war would end in April 1865, there would be much reconstructing that needed to be done. At the beginning of the war, men volunteered to fight, but as the war continued and the death toll rose, both sides turned to drafting men into their respective armies. Both sides drafted able-bodied white males, with Southerners drafting white males between the ages of 18 and 35. This would later be changed to 17 to 50. The North drafted white males between 20 and 45. Both sides had a way for people to get out of service. In the South, those owning 20 slaves or more were exempt, and anyone could hire a substitute. In the North, one could pay $300 to get out of serving. The Southern Army only used slaves, who made up a third of the population at the start of the war, as laborers. At the very end of the war, the South decided to arm slaves, but the war ended before this was actually put into place. The North eventually allowed African Americans to serve, with 180,000 ultimately aiding the Union war effort. Sam Watkins, who wrote an exceptional memoir of his wartime experience, argued that the Civil War was a rich man's war, poor man's fight, as those with slaves were able to get out of the army, and a poor man would not own a single slave. This has been a popular cry for those opposing the draft in American history, reaching a high point a century later during the Vietnam War. Following a big victory over the Union at Second Manassas in July 1862, Robert E. Lee's army was confident, and Lee decided that it was time to take his army north. Lee took his army into Maryland, a border state, in hopes of relieving the state of Virginia, which had been a focal point throughout the war. The battle would be fought in Sharpsburg, Maryland, near Antietam Creek, with Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia facing Union forces, once again led by General George McClellan. The Battle of Antietam was the bloodiest single day in American history. At battle's end, more than 22,000 men would be killed or wounded by the end of the day. The ferocious nature of the fighting was best exhibited along the Sunken Road, where 5,500 men were killed or wounded in only 3 hours in vicious fighting that devolved into hand-to-hand combat. The Sunken Road is now known as the Bloody Lane. The fields surrounding Sharpsburg were littered with bodies of Union and Confederate soldiers. Ultimately, the Union would push Lee back into Virginia, but the ever-cautious McClellan would refuse to follow Lee, giving up an opportunity to potentially destroy his army. Lincoln would respond by firing McClellan for a second time. McClellan would run for president against Lincoln in 1864 and lose. The battle is significant because it was the first time that Lee decided to take the war into the North. Also, as I mentioned before, it was the bloodiest single day in American history, showing how deadly the new technology was during the Civil War. But maybe most importantly, the much-needed victory gave Lincoln the reason to issue his Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln did not think that the government could end the institution of slavery, but using his war powers as president, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation on September 22, 1862. The proclamation said that those slaves in states that were in rebellion would be freed on January 1, 1863. It is important to understand that Southern states did not acknowledge Lincoln's authority, thus he did not have the power to end slavery in the South at the time. Also, it's worth noting, the proclamation did not call for freeing slaves in border states, as Lincoln did not want these states to ultimately secede, or in southern territories controlled by the Union Army. The map shows us the lack of an impact the Emancipation Proclamation has on the institution of slavery. The areas in red are the southern states that are still in rebellion in 1863. We can see that these are areas that would not acknowledge Lincoln's authority. So when Lincoln says the slaves are free in Texas, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Southerners would not be paying attention. The areas in blue are areas that are border states or areas that are southern areas controlled by the Union, where slavery is permitted and the emancipation does not end slavery there. What we can conclude by looking at this map is that the Emancipation Proclamation does not free a single slave. What we know is that it's still very important to the conduct of the rest of the war. The significance of the Emancipation Proclamation is that it changed the motives for fighting the war. Since the beginning of the Civil War, the war was being fought to preserve the Union. The Emancipation made the Civil War about ending the institution of slavery as well as preserving the Union. Also, it allowed for African Americans to join the Union Army, something Frederick Douglass had been calling for throughout the war. And also, the Emancipation Proclamation ended any hope the South had at gaining France and Great Britain as allies, as these countries in Europe would not support the side fighting for the institution of slavery. Following another major victory for Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, this time at Chancellorsville in Virginia, Lee felt his army was ready to move into the North a second time. One note about the Battle of Chancellorsville: Lee would lose his most trusted lieutenant, Stonewall Jackson, when Jackson was killed by his own men accidentally. This would affect Lee's army going forward for the rest of the war. Moving north, Lee's Army of Northern Virginia would meet George Meade's Army of the Potomac at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, between July 1st and July 3rd, 1863. The Battle of Gettysburg had some of the most iconic fighting of the Civil War. At the Devil's Den, men fought in an area covered with boulders. The 20th Indiana lost almost half its men in 30 minutes of ferocious fighting. Both sides lost a third of their manpower at this spot. On top of Little Round Top, Joshua Chamberlain's troops kept the Confederates at bay in fighting that involved a downhill bayonet charge by Union forces after they ran out of ammunition. Pickett's charge is when Confederate forces were ordered to attack the Union position across open terrain. Confederates lost half of their 12,500 men who took part in the assault. This ended the Battle of Gettysburg, and the death would have a major impact on the Southern Army for the rest of the war. For the significance of the Battle of Gettysburg, we might consider that it was the most casualties suffered by Americans in a single battle, 51,000 over 3 days of fighting. Antietam was the bloodiest day of the Civil War with over 22,000. Gettysburg was the bloodiest battle with over 51,000 in 3 days. This would be the last time Lee brought his army north. He would be forced to defend the South for the remainder of the war. And most historians view this battle as the turning point of the Civil War. The South had lost all of its momentum and would never regain it again by the end of the Battle of Gettysburg. On November 19, 1863, Abraham Lincoln delivered a brief speech at a dedication of the cemetery at Gettysburg that was not as well received at the time as it has been since. Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, with its now iconic opening, 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. In the address, Lincoln laid out his vision for America in 1863. In the address, Lincoln lays out the reasons for fighting the Civil War, preserving a country that believed that all men are created equal. Here, Lincoln is blending the ideas of preserving the Union and ending the institution of slavery. Also, Lincoln is clear that Southerners were wrong in their assertion that they were free to leave the Union. Lincoln states that the United States was one nation, not a collection of independent states. For the Confederacy, the Mississippi River was of great significance. By 1863, Ulysses S. Grant was moving towards the last Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River at the fortress Vicksburg. Along the way, Grant destroyed the capital of Mississippi at Jackson, destroying railroads, supplies, and anything that the Confederate Army could use to make war. At one point in Jackson, Grant and his top subordinate, William T. Sherman, walked into a textile factory, and as the two Union generals just stood there, the women continued to work. Eventually, Grant told the women that he would destroy the factory in a matter of minutes, and that they should collect as much fabric as possible before he did so. Grant, a man of his word, then destroyed the factory. Grant supplied his army from the people of Mississippi and destroyed everything else on his way to Vicksburg. Grant's army reached Vicksburg and laid siege to the fort, bombing it continually for 40 days. John Pemberton's Confederate forces inside the fort were subject to Union artillery and sharpshooters who would set up in the trees around the fort and just shoot into the fort whenever they saw people walking around, and were running out of food and supplies. Mules became a main source of food for the defenders of Vicksburg. By July 4, 1863, Pemberton's forces could take it no more and saw no way out of this attack. Pemberton surrendered the fort and his 30,000 men to Grant. Knowing that these men had lost their will to fight, Grant did not send these Confederate soldiers to prison camps. He allowed them to go home. The Union victory at Vicksburg split the Confederacy in half, gave the Union control of the South's most important waterway, the Mississippi River, and provided a major morale boost for the North. Consider the date. Lee retreated from Gettysburg on July 3rd, and on the very next day, John Pemberton surrendered to Grant. An awful 2 days for the Confederacy. A side note, the city of Vicksburg did not celebrate the 4th of July between July 4th, 1863 and July 4th, 1945, after the American victory in Europe during World War II. Not suggesting that these Southerners were bitter, but from the start of the war, Lincoln was plagued with poor military leadership, and we see a series of inept generals leading the Union Army throughout the first 3 years of the war. Winfield Scott, nicknamed Old Fuss and Feathers, one of the worst nicknames I think I've ever heard, was actually born the year of Shays' Rebellion in 1786. He was a veteran of the War of 1812 and was 74 years old when he was tasked with coming up with a plan for the Union at the beginning of the war. Irvin McDowell, best known for retreating from the field at the Battle of First Manassas. We've already talked about George McClellan, who's best known for his cautiousness and his failure to pursue Lee's army on the peninsula in an attempt to get to Richmond. Then it was John Pope, who was routed by Lee at Second Manassas. Then McClellan again, who decided to let Lee's army escape unmolested after Antietam. Then Ambrose Burnside, who is known for losing heavy casualties at Fredericksburg after continually sending his troops to die at Marye's Heights, and for his exceptional facial hair. The term sideburns derived from his last name. Joe Hooker's army was destroyed by Lee's Army of Northern Virginia at Chancellorsville, and George Meade, like McClellan, decided to let Lee's army retreat back into Virginia without pursuit. Luckily, by 1864, Lincoln has found his man, a general who would eventually lead the Union to victory by 1865. The two main generals who would fight to the end of the Civil War were Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee, two men I've spent a lot of time talking about so far. Grant was a West Point graduate. He was a veteran of the Mexican War. He really failed at most things in life that he tried, except for being a soldier. He was known to drink a lot. Reports of his drunkenness at the front were concerning to Lincoln really throughout the first part of the war. A lot of these rumors were started by people who did not like Grant. His victories were many, Forts Henry and Donelson, the capture of the fortress Vicksburg, major victory at Chattanooga. He was the most successful Union general by far, not even close. For the Confederacy, it's Robert E. Lee, who historically has come to really symbolize the South. Like Grant, he was a West Point graduate. He also fought in the Mexican War. He was also the leader of the Marines who captured John Brown at Harper's Ferry. Lee opposed secession, but he did not think that the Union could or should be held together by force, and ultimately he would decide to side with his state of Virginia. He was appointed the leader of the Army of Northern Virginia in 1862, and he had several major victories, the 7 Days Battle, Second Manassas, Fredericksburg, and Chancellorsville, and he was the most successful Confederate general. Upon taking control of the Union Army, Grant's objective was clear. He was to destroy Lee's army in Virginia. And by 1864, Southern morale was low. The army lacked food, weapons, shoes, and uniforms. They could not wage an offensive war. They're basically on the defensive, and they lacked sufficient reinforcements. Grant never shied away from a fight. He launched a series of brutal attacks on Lee's army beginning in May 1864 at battles named the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, and finally Petersburg. In 6 weeks, Grant lost 60,000 men to Lee's 32,000. The fighting at Cold Harbor shows how brutal the fighting was, with Grant losing 7,000 men in less than an hour. At Cold Harbor today, one can see the trench lines dug by both sides. Despite these losses, Lee was always forced to retreat and could not add any manpower to his quickly diminishing army. While Lee's army was dug in around Petersburg, Grant's subordinate, William Sherman, had captured Atlanta and started what came to be known as Sherman's March to the Sea. On his route to Savannah, Sherman's army destroyed Confederate property, factories, farms, and supplied his army from the people of Georgia. Sherman claimed that he wanted to make the people of Georgia howl. The picture there shows a Sherman bow tie, which was how Union soldiers destroyed Confederate railroads. They heated up the iron and bent them so they could not be reused. The goal of Sherman's March to the Sea was similar to Grant's at Jackson, Mississippi a year earlier. He wanted to destroy the South's ability to fight the war physically and psychologically. And on March 4, 1865, Abraham Lincoln was sworn in for his second term. The war was winding down, and Lincoln's address showed that he was thinking about post-war America. In his second inaugural address, Lincoln said, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. And the war would end in April 1865. On April 2nd, Jefferson Davis and his government abandoned their capital at Richmond. Lee was defeated at Petersburg and found himself surrounded at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. And on April 9, 1865, he surrendered to Grant, ending the American Civil War. Lee urged his fellow Southerners to accept defeat and stop fighting. Let's close the show by considering that the war was over and a debate would ensue on how best to put the Union back together. 6 days after Lee's surrender, the President and Mrs. Lincoln decided to take in a play, Our American Cousin, at Ford's Theater. We'll never know what the President was thinking that day as he left the White House on April 14th for what would be the last time. Good night, Albuquerque.